Get him. How exactly did they do it? Do we have a clear idea of that? Joining us, Chris McDonough, the interview room with Chris McDonough, and retired FBI special agent and expert in criminal investigations, Bobby Chacon. Great to see you both. Now, I want to read a couple of excerpts from a Slate article entitled "How Police Actually Cracked the Idaho Killings Case." According to a law enforcement source familiar with the investigation with whom I spoke, a key reason police focused on this suspect as a likely suspect has to do with something that is never mentioned in the 18-page affidavit that I've just been reading from. Forensic genealogy. It was only after investigators utilized a technique reliant on genealogy databases to determine who'd left DNA on a tan leather knife sheath that police requested a search warrant for the accused killer's phone records, according to this source. Up until that point, in late December, he hadn't stood out among all the other Elantra owners, the source said, something that is reinforced by a close, informed reading of the affidavit. So, Bobby Chacon, I'll begin with you. It seems to me that when we all read that affidavit, there was something to read between the lines. And now this has become a big issue in court, which is about this IGG, investigative genealogy, that is a part of the case. Is that really the key to how they were able to narrow things down and get it to the point where they could go to a judge and get a warrant so they could get his phone records and continue their investigation to identify him as the suspect here?
Yeah, you know, Vinny, I know that IGG is the big sexy thing now, and everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. And I actually want to, maybe I'm the minority here, but I don't think it is in this case. I think it helped. I think it was a, I don't think it was the linchpin. I think they were onto this guy. Remember what's not said in this affidavit, which the police did know at this time, is they had already interviewed an eyewitness that saw the suspect leaving the house. They kept that really under wraps. They kept her description of this guy, how tall he was, the bushy eyebrows. All of that was kept really under wraps for a good reason. So they were doing really good police work, narrowing it down, getting your pool of suspects, Elantra owners in the area, phone records. They were doing the standard stuff that you do in every case. Now, IGG does help. It helps narrow down your suspect pool. It doesn't give you the suspect. It helps you narrow it down, and then it helps you get to the suspect that then you can obtain a DNA. You know, they did a cheek swab eventually and compare it directly to the knife sheath, and then you have the, you know, what I call the 100% match, 5.3 cotillion or whatever it is, octillion. So I think that they did the normal police work. You read the affidavit. I think they would have gotten the warrants without IGG in this case. They would have gotten the warrants for his phone and things like that. I think that it was a big help, but I don't think it was. I don't think this case doesn't get made without IGG.
Chris McDonough, so they don't mention the IGG, but it's clearly a part of the case because now there's a motion related to the IGG. A lot of things have been sealed, like you said. Defense wants to unseal it. So do you think they could have gotten to this suspect without the IGG? Was there still enough there? Did this just make it quicker? Because there's a couple steps in the process, right? The IGG gets them quicker to the suspect, but there's still not enough for an arrest. They go to the house in Pennsylvania, they get the father's DNA from the garbage, still not, it's enough for an arrest, but then it's not the positive match until they swab him. So it's like a three-step process with the DNA here. What are your thoughts on the role of the IGG, and was that the linchpin? Bobby doesn't think so. What do you think?
You know, I agree with Bobby. I mean, and just to dovetail into the thought process there, remember when this thing first goes down, there is a massive amount of resources on the ground. And so in any investigation like this, you're going to have a team inside the house, you're going to have a team outside of the house doing like a canvassing, you know, trying to pull video, et cetera, and interviewing witnesses in relationship to neighbors, if they hear or see, you know, anything like that. So we don't know just yet how much amount of information they had from the get-go. And when the IGG information shows up, you know, that's kind of like a bonus, right? I mean, that officer that went back and started querying the cars through, you know, the university there and came up with a similar Elantra, well, then you can just pick up the phone and call the FBI, and right away, if you have them on the scene, you got a direct source going there, and that information can accelerate pretty rapidly.
All right, so let's talk about this for a second, Bobby, because the way they're using the IGG is it's not evidence, it's not something that should be used as probable cause for an arrest, but they treat it as a tip, and I've seen people talk about it almost like an anonymous tip. And law enforcement doesn't like to mention it. And I think that's what happened in this case, because it's not in the arrest affidavit. There's no mention of it. And you don't have to mention everything there, but it seems like it played a role here, yet law enforcement doesn't necessarily want that to be part of the record. Why is that, Bobby? Why do you think that is?
You know, I don't know why it is, but my guess is, and just to be clear, IGG has a really big role in some cases, and some cases it's the only thing that leads you to the suspect. So it's very valuable. This is a new area of DNA investigations that's very valuable. I just happen to think in this particular case, they had the Elantra, they had a Washington State University student registered to a white Elantra that seemed, so they were on their way to identifying him. In this case, IGG was kind of a very big help, but it wasn't everything in this case. In some cases it is. I think they don't want to mention the IGG stuff because remember where it all comes from. It comes from a voluntary database that, you know, Cece mentioned earlier that, you know, not all people dedicate their DNA to this, and the biggest services like the one I'm in, one of the bigger ones, doesn't allow law enforcement to query it. So, you know, when you're dealing, you don't want to make people hesitant to give their DNA into these programs and into these companies because they sensationalize it. They say, oh, the law enforcement's looking at all these people in these databases, and then you get, as a business owner, you wouldn't want that to happen either. You don't want people hesitant to put in, and so I think like it's a quiet, you know, kind of tool they pull off the shelf that they can use. Find the suspect and then put it back, and then not tell anybody. Not that they don't tell anybody, they just don't want it like all that publicized because they don't want people pulling back from participating in that.
Yeah, the next show I want to do is Bobby Chacon. I want to know where your ancestry goes to because I think that would be really interesting. Chris McDonough, thanks for all your help. Bobby Chacon, thank you as well. Great to see you both. Still to come, what happens if the defense is successful and the DNA is suppressed?
Law enforcement may or may not have used databases that they had the right to access.
How are we doing, guys? We're good? Okay.
You're on very shaky ground.
That is unreal.
People wanted answers, and people started locking their doors.
I did not do it to hurt anybody.
You know what it means. You know what you did, right?
Please hear me out. Please.
This was a real-life soap opera. And I said, OJ, everybody thinks you're guilty.
For certain. Another critical piece of information that you learned today, Judge, is that law enforcement may or may not have used databases that they had the right to access. We don't know.
So this is where the defense appears to be going when it comes to the DNA, is that they're saying they may have used data that they're not permitted to use to tie this defendant and to arrest this defendant and to tie him to the knife sheath. The DNA that was found on the snap on the knife sheath. They may have used data that they weren't supposed to use. They want it all revealed. And ultimately what they want is they want the DNA suppressed, not admissible, which brings us to the next question in our investigation, which is, what happens if the DNA is suppressed? What if the defense is successful in one of their motions to keep the DNA from being a part of the trial to keep the DNA away from the jury. Join me, two guys who know Idaho law very, very, very well. The attorney represented Chad Daybell, John Pryor, and trial lawyer and former Idaho Attorney General Dave Leroy. All right, John, what's your analysis of this case if, in fact, the DNA is gone and they can't connect the suspected killer to this knife sheath that was found at the crime scene?
Well, I think, Vinny, what they're talking about is the IGG evidence and excluding that in terms of the databases that they used. And in that case, that's just that evidence is really evidence of exclusion. What they're trying to do is pull away as many people as they can from that to do that. If it's excluded, it's a part. I mean, the defense is doing it because it's just one more piece that they can not have to worry about or address that might implicate their client. If we're talking about the blood evidence, I think that's huge. I think it's a huge issue if the blood evidence is excluded.
So, Dave Leroy, if you can't connect the defendant to something that was found at the crime scene in this case, which was the knife sheath, if you can't make that direct connection, if you are somehow denied the ability to do that by some of this pretrial litigation, a lot of which is under seal, how strong is this prosecution case? How difficult will it be to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt?
Well, this case is still provable beyond a reasonable doubt, but the most significant evidence in the case is the knife sheath, which was not only evident with the DNA, but it was found under the body of one of the victims and under a cover that was adjacent to her body. Therefore, it was probably left when it was covered up at the scene to tie any individual to that scene, and that particular knife sheath is the most singular significant piece of evidence in the case. If that should be lost, and I don't think it will be at the trial level, if that should be lost, then it still is a circumstantial case that I think the prosecutor can prove. But the whole effort here, I believe, is not to win a trial, but is to create a brand new constitutional right to a privacy protection under the U.S. Constitution for the DNA of third parties, including relatives. If you can argue that you somehow have a privacy interest in that, and you can therefore independently suppress that kind of evidence at a trial, then they've created a whole new area of constitutional law. That's where we're headed with these arguments. I don't expect an Idaho judge at the trial level to buy into that. I wouldn't expect the Idaho Supreme Court to find that to be valid, but it will be presented one day, I presume, should a conviction be had in this case, to the United States Supreme Court. That's where they want to head. This case is capable of conviction without the evidence, but that's the reason we're having such a fight about the knife sheath. It weakens the prosecution case if it's lost, and if it stays in, it creates an argument against the United States Constitution.
So what would be the impact here, John, potentially, if the defense is right in their assertion that the data that they accessed, they're not entitled to access? They somehow...
Well, I agree with David. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, if they were able to access something that they weren't supposed to access, so what's the impact of that? Is there an impact on this case?
Well, the impact is that evidence, if they used an inappropriate or were inappropriate in accessing a website, the evidence is excluded. I agree with David, this is still a circumstantial case, but obviously if DNA or IGG evidence is excluded because inappropriate actions by law enforcement or others, it makes their case a little harder. And I agree with David as well that it also sets it up not only for an appealable issue that could go on for years, but also setting up the possibility that a higher court would at some point adopt a situation where you're invading people's privacy, and I wholeheartedly agree with what David's assertion there.
So, looking at how this case was investigated, and I think I understand it, despite all the things that are sealed. And what the assertion is that they used all these different pieces, but one of the pieces they used to get to the next step, to get the next piece, was this IgG. So if the IgG gets thrown out, do we get into the world, and I'm going to say it, I know it's from law school, but it's for real. We only have a couple seconds here. Is this, and just a yes or no, is it potentially fruit of the poisonous tree that everything that followed must get thrown out, which could throw out the arrest, the probable cause here? Is it, just give me a yes or no, because we're really short on time. David, you first.
You get an A on the bar exam. The fruit of the poisonous tree will be exactly what the defense argues here, to throw out the DNA if there is a constitutional right of privacy in someone else's DNA.
All right, we're out of time for tonight, but you know I'm going to be calling on both of you throughout this case, so don't make any plans for late summer, early fall. John Pryor, Dave Leroy, thanks so much. Pre-trial litigation is important. This is the time when the judge makes crucial calls and decisions on what the trial will look like and what evidence the jury will see. But pre-trial hearings are no different than a trial. It's all public. It's a public trial in a public courtroom. There should be no secrets.